guys, it's Alice, and today I'm going to review the books I've read in the past 2 weeks. The first book that I read was The Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a classic fairy tale, and this book actually contains 2 stories. We have The Wild Swans as well as a story called The Nightingale. Now, this author's stories were a pretty big part of my childhood, and I can't distinctly remember reading these, but I'm pretty sure that I did, like back in the day when I was a kid. So reading them again felt really wonderful and nostalgic. The stories in here are filled with magic and atmosphere and beautiful imagery, even if they are quite short. And this particular edition has some drawings in it, like black and white line drawings, which I felt like really added something to it, although they're only in the first story, the Wild Swans one, which I actually thought was a little sad because the second story, The Nightingale, was my favorite out of the 2. I think this is a great little read for anyone who enjoys fairy tales, and I do love this particular edition, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The second book that I read was The Devotion of Suspect X by Kaigo Higashino. This is a crime novel, and it's been translated from Japanese by Alexander O. Smith, and it's set in Tokyo, where a woman's ex-husband has been murdered, and we get to read about this mystery from the perspective of the woman's neighbor, and the detective investigating the case. This was a pretty interesting book, and I'm really glad that I read it. It's not your typical crime book in a lot of ways, which I thought was really cool. You're told quite early on a lot about the murder, but then throughout the story, different facets of the characters and facts of the crime sort of come to light. It's the kind of book where the further in you get, the more you start questioning things and wondering what's actually going on, until you get to read about it in what was a very surprising and twisty ending. It's kind of more of a psychological crime book than all about the action, which I really liked. I think most of the characters in here are quite interesting, but I did notice that the woman felt a little bit flat, and I think she could have been better developed. The language and the writing isn't particularly intricate or descriptive, really. Even though this has like an amazing tension throughout the whole book, I sometimes wished that there were more descriptions of the different settings and some of the characters. Like I mentioned, the ending of this was very surprising, and I would be extremely impressed if anyone read this and managed to like figure it out, because I really don't think you can. I do think we spent a little too much time getting there. Like, some parts in this did feel a little bit slow, but I do think it's worth getting through those parts just to get to the end, because wow. Overall though, I very much enjoyed this, and it was kind of fun to read a little bit of a different type of like mystery thriller crime book, and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. And I would definitely read more books by this author if there are any more translated into English. Second to last, I finished Det var ikke voldtekt, 10 män försvarar sig i rätten by Heidi Helene Sveen. This is a non-fiction book, and it translates to It Wasn't Rape, 10 men defend themselves in court, and in it we get to read about 10 different rape cases that have appeared in Norwegian court, and through these cases the author sort of explores rape myths, consent, and how we look and talk about rape and sexual assault in our society. This was a difficult book to read in a lot of ways, but it was very, very interesting. And I think I mentioned this when I got this book, that I had never read any books about rape that specifically focus on Norway, and I think that I went into this with the idea that like, oh, you know, most people here, they know about rape myths, and they know that all of that stuff is just like not true, but apparently that is not the case. Like I mentioned, we take a look at 10 different cases in this, and in most of them we see the defense and the person accused of rape using rape myths to try and free themselves of blame. And I am aware that maybe like some of the lawyers and stuff, they don't actually believe in these things, but they use them because they know that that's maybe the only way they'll be able to get away with it. So there is a lot in here about the victims being asked like, what were you wearing? How much were you drinking? You went home with him, so can you really blame him for raping you while you were unconscious? At the end of each chapter, the author takes a closer look at whatever approach was used in each case and sort of explores and explains why that tactic could be effective. And she talks quite a lot about public perception versus what the science tells us. Like, for instance, some people feel like the way a victim reacts after something traumatic has happened, if they don't react like the right way, that calls into question their credibility. Whereas the science actually tells us that people react to traumatic events in all kinds of ways, and there is no right way to act or react to those things. It is extremely infuriating and provocative to read about how the accused and their defense ask the victims all of these completely irrelevant questions and try to shift the blame onto them. And there are a lot of details included in this book, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to read, I think. But I think it was the right choice to keep all of those details in there because it's shocking, but you're right to be shocked. One thing to note about this is that all of the cases in here end up with the accused being condemned. So there are no cases where they go free, so we only sort of see one side of these types of cases. Overall though, I thought this was very interesting and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Lastly, I finished The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. This is another nonfiction book, and in it the author delves into the science of climate change and explores the different and devastating consequences that the warming of the earth will have. I don't know if all of you guys saw that video, but when I got this book, I remember saying something like, I want to read this book even though I know it will give me anxiety because I already have anxiety about this, so I might as well be well informed. Yeah, I didn't know what I was getting into at all. This is the most alarming book that I have ever read, and yet I think it's a very good book. It's informative and it's relatively easy to understand, and it is alarming for a reason because I think the effects of global warming is going to be so much worse than most of us realize. I feel like I learned a lot from this, and it explores things that I knew were going to be a consequence of global warming, but then also stuff that I had never even thought about or considered. It's completely unflinching and it doesn't sugarcoat anything. And sometimes it almost feels surreal because what is in here is so dire. I'm not gonna lie, this has made me feel very little hope, and I feel extremely overwhelmed, and I don't really know what to do about that. I do think that's kind of the point of the book though, because I think a lot of us sort of put these things in the back of our minds and we fool ourselves to believe that things are just gonna somehow work themselves out, which is entirely false. Some of what is in here is of course speculation, which the author himself points out several times because it is impossible to absolutely accurately predict what's gonna happen. But the book sort of shows us the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, and it shows us, and I think this is important to know, that the best case scenario is still going to be really bad. Even though I think the point of this book is to be alarming, I do wish that there was at least a glimmer of light somewhere in here, which at least I didn't see. I felt like I got all of these things coming at me, and it made me feel almost like giving up. And the book focuses so much on the negative, which again it does for a reason because it is really, really bad. There is so much of it that I don't know how to take it in. I do feel like I haven't really completely digested this book yet, and I think that's gonna take some time, and I can tell that this review is a little bit rambly and my thoughts are not very finished or refined, but that's where I'm at right now, and I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. Now, finally onto the books that I'm reading right now. I'm still making my way through the Virago Book of Witches, which I feel like I've shown you a million times now. And then I think I'm gonna start a book I just got in the mail, and it is The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. And this is a science fiction dystopian novel, and it looks really good. Okay guys, those were all the books that I had to share with you today. Let me know what you guys have been reading lately, and I will see you soon. Bye!